we start with the presentation, and as you already know, we will speak about the swing phase, and I think swing phase is a little bit underrepresented in all the presentations because it's a very difficult motion event. So a lot of presentations or studies exist to break over or landing or some motions during stance phase, but swing phase is still a little bit miracle in some aspects. So today we will speak about the biomechanics and some anatomy facts who are responsible or related to swing phase. And the next webinar we will speak about the influence of trimming and shoeing on this phase. But I think to understand what we can achieve by our trim or by our shoeing, it's important to understand at least some facts about the swing phase. And that is why we focus today on the geometry, so how the hoof moves during the space in swing phase, and on the timing of swing phase. So these two facts will be the topic of today. And I brought again some cases, or at least two cases to start. And here you see a horse with uneven feet. We have an angle difference between left and right of 9 degrees, which is quite something. And the background is that there was a theory that the hoof angulation is related to the motion of the limb during swing phase, to the flight arc in particular. So there was the meaning or the thinking that if you have an acute hoof angle, that the flight arc has its peak a little bit earlier, and if you have a steep hoof angle, the flight arc has its peak a little bit later. Nice. So the hoof angle is more or less, or was more or less associated to the swing phase motion. But if you see our example, you see we have uneven feet with different angulations. So according to the theory, it should be an uneven flight arc as well. But there is no uneven flight arc. So this horse has a very fine symmetrical flight arc between left and right forelimb. So there must be other factors in the hoof angulation that affect the motion of the hoof during swing phase. Yeah, and that's what we will talk about in the next minutes. So this is the first case, raising some questions. And the second case is a customer of mine with varus conformation and a toed-in conformation. Usually it's much worse. So this is directly after trimming. I couldn't find a good picture of it before trimming. So usually he's standing much worse. So he has a very obvious varus conformation. So, and if you check the limbs, so the right one is the limb with the deviation. And you see in walk, both limbs are more or less even. So you have quite straight motion of the limb during swing phase. So the sideway motion is very small, just 3 centimeters. But in trot, you see the left one, the straighter one, is still quite straight in the flight arc as well. But the right one with the limb deviation, with the varus conformation, it has a kind of 16 centimeters sideway motion to lateral during swing phase. This is quite something. And of course, you could say, okay, I can see it by eye that the limb is moving to lateral during swing phase. But the more important fact is if you compare the timings. So if you look at trot on the straight limb and the varus limb, there is a absolutely or more or less symmetrical timing. So there's just 1 millisecond difference between the left and the right forelimb. Although the right one is having a flight, have a sideway motion of 16 centimeters, and the left one is going very straight. So although they make a completely different geometry, they have the same timing. So that means that the musculature or the motion system, so the locomotor system itself, need to compensate somewhere. Otherwise, we wouldn't have the same timing for such different motions. So this is also a second question. So what is really compensating the differences in maybe limb conformation or motion of the limb during swing phase? I think both questions we can answer in the end of the presentation, but I would like to explain the clinical relevance, why we are talking about swing phase. I think it's because we all evaluate horses in motion. Usually it's a basic or the reference for our daily work. So we check the horses coming to us, so looking from the front, and we check it on a straight line and walk and trot, and we check the motion of the limb during swing phase, of course, as well. And that's why the swing phase also influences the load of the hoof during landing. So the way the hoof is moving during swing phase affects the landing of the hoof in the initial ground contact. And the second practical relevance is that we evaluate motion quality in different disciplines. So you have usually disciplines like dressage or show horses or trotting or gaited horses like Icelandic horses, which should have a really expressive, nice flight arc, with a lot of activity in the motion. So that's what we would like to see in these disciplines. And when you have the Western riding, the discipline pleasure, you would like to see a very smooth and flat flight arc, for example. So the flight arc and the bilateral symmetry, they are very well seen in disciplines as stated. And of course, you would like to see in all athletic disciplines an optimal limb coordination. And this is all related to the motion of the limb in swing phase. So stance phase is usually not really evaluated for athletic purpose. It's more or less the flight arc or the swing phase. And I brought you two examples. So you see an Icelandic horse. They are ridden to have a very active, high motion of the limb in the swing phase. And you see it has a height of 22 centimeters. If you have it in fast tilt, it can go up to almost 30 centimeters. So this is a quite high motion. And in the lower image you see, or the lower example, you see a friend of mine riding pleasure. And you see they want to have a very flat and smooth flight arc without a lot of action. So these are the differences. And I think for follow-up examination, yeah, so if you would like to evaluate the training or maybe your shoeing, so you could measure the horses before and after your work. So then you could maybe measure it with the rider and you say, okay, we achieved a more active or we achieved a flatter motion of the limb during swing phase. So this can be very important if you really work with athletic horses in specific disciplines. And another relevance is if you have deviations from the straight line. So usually the optimal movement would be if you have a motion of the limb in a straight sagittal line. So this would be for all motions the most efficient way. But we all know that more or less no horses have a very straight movement. So we have sometimes some limbs, but in general, a lot of deviations are visible. So horses can wing in, they can wing out, they can adduct or abduct limbs. So we all know that we have all types of movement during swing phase. So sideway motion is very common. But there's an agreement that usually the sideway motion of the limb during swing phase is not related to less performance, for example. So they don't compromise soundness or aesthetic performance. And there's still the idea that you have a correlation between the sideway motion of the limb during swing phase and initial contact during landing. So we are working on it to prove it, but we are not ready yet. But I think in parts it is like it. But we will see some examples where we couldn't prove it. And then, of course, you have to remember if you have sideway motions during swing phase. Yeah, so if we have winging in or winging out, we have to, or we should be sure, we can be sure that we have uneven load of different muscle groups. For example, they have to stabilize the limb. So different muscles have to act or have to work to stabilize the limb motion in swing phase. And this is also some stress to the joints and the ligaments and the tendons. Yeah, of course, it would be nicer to have a straight movement, but we know that all the segments and all the parts of the locomotor system have to work to stabilize the limb. And it becomes even worse if you have horses which are striking. So if they hit the contralateral limb, if they're walking, this can cause, of course, injuries. And it's, of course, in this case, compromise soundness or athletic performance. So somebody has the mic on, so it would be nice if you switched off. And then, of course, another practical relevance is if you evaluate lameness. So we can be sure that any dysfunctions in the proximal locomotor system, so any kind of muscle tension, muscle atrophy, hypertrophy, or neurological problems, for example, paralysis, They can affect the swing phase, or they definitely affect the swing phase. And in particular, if you have problems in the neck or the back or the pelvis, you will see changes or bilateral asymmetries in the flight arc, for example, during swing phase. I will explain which muscle groups work in which phase of swing phase or which part of swing phase. And this will maybe help you to evaluate lameness in horses where you're not really sure. So sometimes swing phase lamenesses are difficult to examine or to evaluate. And I hope to give you at least some facts that it will be a little bit easier for you. Yeah, so this is more or less the relevance. And we will speak about the timing aspect first and then go to the geometry of swing phase. Yeah. So the timing is definitely shown or recorded by Black, and it is visible in the timing table. And timing itself is defined as the period between last hoof ground contact, so before the hoof leaves the ground, and then the initial contact of the hoof in the next step. So this is actually the time of swing phase. And it's the time where the limb is more or less commuting around the shoulder. So it's more or less protracted and retracted, and it needs some time to do it. And of course, the faster the horse walks and the faster the gait becomes, so from walk to trot to gallop, the stride duration increase, and we have a bigger stride, but the swing duration is not changing. So I brought you two timetables of one horse, and you can see it in walk and you can see it in trot. And we check the swing phase. So we check the swing phase between walk and trot in this horse. And if you see the timing between walk and trot, there's just a difference of 6 milliseconds. So walk and trot have just a timing difference of 6 milliseconds for swing phase. If you compare mid-stance, so if you check how long the hoof is on the ground or mid-stance, you see walk is 410 milliseconds slower than trot, but not in swing phase. So swing phase keeps more or less the same. So it's not related to the gait, the timing stays more or less the same. And in addition, there's no correlation between the time or the duration of mid-stance and the stride length or the breakover duration. So it doesn't matter if the hoof or the horse breaks over faster or slower in one hoof, the swing phase is not correlated to this timing factor of breakover. Yeah, so there must be something different than just the hoof or just the stride length. So swing phase is a more or less independent phase. Yeah, so it's a little bit different to all the other phases. So if you check stance phase and breakover and landing and mid-stance, this is all related to the speed, and this is all connected to each other. Swing phase is a little bit different. Yeah. And from the geometric aspect, we will speak about the flight arc. So this is actually just the vertical hoof flight pattern during swing phase if we look at it from the side. And it's lasting from breakover. Usually if you check the curve in Black, you see a little bump. So this is just because on the dorsal hoof wall, you have the sensor and then the hoof is breaking over. You see first a little movement, like a little bump. If you check breakover, and then the limb is protracted until maximal extension. So then you have extended limb, and then shortly before landing, it's a little bit retraction of the limb. And this is just to reduce the velocity and to decrease forces acting during initial contact. But we will see it later. So this is how Black is showing the flight arc. So how I said, during breakover, we have this highlighted with a little bump. And then, of course, the hoof is lifting the ground, so the curve is increasing, so it's getting more height. Then you have somewhere a peak, so the peak depends on the conformation and some other things we will see later. And then, of course, shortly before breakover, the limb is a little bit retracted, how I said, to decrease the velocity. So this is how you see it in Black. Yeah, and in literature, it said you have a biphasic curve, so you have more or less two peaks. This is often right, but it really depends on the individual motion pattern of each horse. So sometimes you have one clear peak, and sometimes you have a little smooth peak and then a second one, but it's not often so clear. Yeah. So for example, you see two cases. This is just to show you how individual the flight arc can be. Two sound horses walking on a straight line on firm ground in a trot. So you see the peak in the first case is quite early, and in the second case it's quite late. So this depends, how I said, on the horse, on the conformation, on the motor learning, on training, maybe on the use. So many factors influence the shape of the flight arc. Yeah. And another fact, so now you see one horse, you see in yellow the left and in red the right hoof, and you see the horse before and after initial shoeing in the first two lines, so A and B, and then you see C and D before and after the second shoeing, and E and F before and after the fourth shoeing. So you see the flight arcs over a few months of one horse in the right and left hoof. And if you compare the curves, you see the flight arc is more or less staying absolutely the same, independent from the shoeing or the time. So not it doesn't matter which month or which day or whatever it is. So the flight arc stays more or less the same. So this means the flight arc also belongs to the individual gait pattern of each horse. And everybody who knows me know that I stated or that I showed quite often the motion pattern of the hoof on the ground during stance phase. And I always said the motion of the hoof during stance phase is like a fingerprint. Yeah, it's very stable, very repeatable, and it's belonging to each individual, and it's not changing by nothing. So usually you need something really severe to change the motion pattern of an individual. And it's the same with the flight arc. Yeah. And we also know there was a nice study of a German research group in Hanover. They checked 19 sound horses, and they checked these horses for skewness. So they checked for symmetry in their motion pattern, and they could show that you have differences between left and right front hoofs and left and right hind hoofs in pro and retraction of the limb. So it's very natural to have asymmetries independent from lameness, just because you have a lateralized motion behavior due to handiness of horses. So sometimes they have a quite strong left hand or quite strong right hand. So this is why you see these asymmetries in the motion pattern. Yeah, and this is very natural. Other factors influencing the flight arc are, as stated, the hoof angulation, but how we learned already, there's something more than just hoof angulation who are shaping the flight arc. What is definitely having an influence on the flight arc is the weight of the hoofs, and this is what we usually also use if we try to affect it by our shoeing. And the heavier the hoof, the higher is the flight arc usually. And this is something we will speak about the next time for sure. But also with increasing velocity, the flight arc increases in height. In contrast, if you have a lameness, usually if you have a lameness of the related to the proximal locomotor system, the flight arc of the affected limb is lower. Yeah, and usually you have a bilateral asymmetry in lame horses. So the flight arc is really dependent on some factors, but I will show you some examples or some more examples for hoof angulation. Here you see one case, again, with a very severe difference in hoof angulation. You have 13 degrees difference between left and right. The left hoof is the steeper hoof, the right one is the more acute angled hoof, and you see the steeper hoof has a lower peak than the flatter, the acute hoof. But the peaks are more or less the same. So the shape of the curves are not really different. So it's not that you can say the peak in the steeper hoof is later than in the flatter hoof. So this theory is maybe, in my opinion, just wrong. But you see differences in the height. After trimming and a little bit correction, we could more or less adapt the hoof angles to a difference to 6 degrees, so almost the half. The influence on the flight arc is moderate. Yeah, so you see a little more equal height of the flight arc, so it changed. So now the steeper hoof is a little bit increased a little bit in height, and the flatter hoof is decreased a little bit in height. But yeah, it's not really a clear line. It's just showing that something is happening to the hoof, to the horse. Yeah. And In contrast, again, we have another horse with artificially acquired difference in hoof angulation. We had to do a resection of the dorsal hoof wall, so we had to shorten the so we had to shorten the left hoof, the wall of the left hoof, the toe of the left hoof quite a lot. So that's why we had a very different hoof angulation from one moment to the other. So the horse had not really time to adapt on it. And although we created such a severe angle difference between left and right hoof, the horse has still the same flight arc in shape and in height. So this horse compensates everything. And this is a very, very interesting case. So this is actually a very good trained sport horse, which was used to carry the wagon. So this was competing in its discipline. And it was very good trained. It had a very low variation between strides. So the locomotor system was very well adapted to the task and to all the motorical learning. So our change in hoof angulation couldn't really affect something. And now we speak about the sideway motion. Sorry, Bart, can you hear me? Bart?
Yes.
Can you mute everybody except of me? Thanks.
I did.
Thanks. That's very nice. Okay, now we can speak a little bit easier. So this is a little bit distracting. So we speak about the sideway motion now. So we spoke about the flight arc. Now we speak about the sideway motion, which is also very interesting. And this is the horizontal hoof flight pattern during swing phase. So we know typical deviations like winging in, winging out, plating, adduction, abduction. In black, we can measure all of it and you will get a result. So you have the colored line, so the yellow line, for example, and this is just the average motion or movement of all recorded strides. The yellow shadow around it, this is the variation between strides. In my opinion, this is a quite interesting parameter. So the bigger the shadow is, the more variation you have between the strides. And if you have very young horses, for example, or very unbalanced horses, this shadow is usually a little bit bigger. And if you have good trained horses, stable horses, maybe riding school horses, which are doing all day long their work, usually you have less shadow, so you have less variation. And then, of course, you can see the maximum inwards or outward movement of the limb. Yeah. And here you have 4 cases just to show you how different the sideway motion of the limb can look during swing phase. So it can be as in horse 1, for example, that between left and right, you have quite a good symmetry in motion. And then you can have, for example, as in horse 2, differences between left and right. And you can have, for example, compared with horse 2 and 4, high variation and low variation in their steps. So you can have all kinds of sideway motion patterns in swing phase for different horses. And it's also one fact, it might be different between walk and trot. So if you remember your daily work, if you evaluate horses and walk and trot on a straight line, it can be that horses are walking in the walk different than in trot, so it don't have to be correlated how they move their limbs in swing phase between these 2 gaits. But in this example, it's the same horse as I showed you before. So we see the sideway motion of the left limb, of the left front limb, before and after initial trimming, and then after 2 months, and then after the 4th trimming, and also in trot. And you can again see that the pattern, the shape of the sideway motion is more or less always the same between the different situations. So also the sideway motion of the limb during swing phase belongs to the individual motion pattern of each horse. And it can be, don't has to be, but it can be very equal in trot, but sometimes you see differences. This, my opinion, also depends on the conformation of the horse and the weight of the hoofs. There was a very nice research, again, from a German group. I'm sorry, but there are some English publications to it. And they examined 28 sound horses, and they checked the limb conformation, and then they correlated the limb conformation with the motion during swing and stance phase. And the first statement was that none of the 28 examined horses had a regular straight limb conformation. So it's very rare that you have a straight limb conformation. And then you have to imagine the limb has different segments. So you have the toe, you have the metacarpus, you have the carpus, you have the brachium. So you have different parts of the limb, different segments. And it's very rare that one of the segments has a straight movement during swing phase. Usually you have at least one deviation from the ideal straight line in the segments during the whole swing phase. So they do all the time a sideways motion, and there's not a correlation between the movement of the proximal and distal limb. So the table shows you that you have, for example, the coffin joint and the movement of the radius. So the radius is quite proximal, the coffin joint is belonging to the hoof, so very distal, and there's just a correlation of 16% in the movement between these two segments. So during swing phase, the coffin joint is moving more or less independent from the radius, for example, and you can make these correlations also for the metacarpus and the coffin joint or the fetlock. So the correlation between the segments of the limbs is not very high. But they also showed that the movement of the proximal limb during swing phase correlates with the initial contact in the beginning of stance phase. So this is already a proof of the theory we stated in the beginning. Yeah. And there are some other factors influencing the sideways motion. We already talked about some of them. Of course, it's the hoof and limb conformation, as we saw in the first case, but also the asymmetry in the articular surfaces. So we said it already in the lecture 2 breakover that we have slight asymmetries in the digital joints, for example. So we have a bigger and a smaller surface, yeah, between, for example, medial and lateral. And of course, it would be nice to have a straight sagittal movement, but if you have slight asymmetries in a joint, it can't move straight anymore. And these asymmetries are not just in the digital joints, they are also, for example, in the elbow or in the carpus or in the shoulder joint. So this is why the individual conformation, the individual shape of the joints is responsible for the individual motion pattern. And as we know, these asymmetries also influence breakover, and breakover is the phase before swing phase. So breakover initiate the swing phase. So that's why if you have horses breaking over lateral, for example, they will have a different swing phase pattern than horses breaking over the medial toe, for example. And a very, very important fact is the neuromuscular learning. I will explain it to you in the next slides. So our nerve system and our locomotor system, they are learning all lifelong. So we all learn different motion patterns, and this is shaping also the movement, for example, during swing phase. And one of the most important or most efficient factors influencing the sideways motion during swing phase is pain. So in the moment horses have pain, they directly change their motion pattern. And here I just have the example again. So this is just to show you the asymmetries in the joint surfaces. And I think you can imagine if you have these asymmetries, it's very likely that this horse have deviations in the sideways motion during swing phase as well. Yeah. And here again, this is just to show you that most of the horses break over the lateral toe. And yeah, this might be correlated to some motion patterns during swing phase as well, but there will be something different. So we have 75 horses breaking over the lateral toe in our studies, but this would mean that a lot of horses, for example, would like to tend to wing in, but this is not the case. So this correlation is there, but it's not 100%. So, and this is why I would like to explain you a little bit about locomotion physiology, because I think if you understood this, you understand the character and influences on swing phase. So usually the gait pattern is defined as a well-coordinated segmental motion of the limb. So all parts of the limb need to move more or less coordinated. And the segments of the limb, they consist of an active part. So the active locomotor system is the musculature. So muscles are the only tissue who are able to contract, so they can actively change their length. And they move parts of the passive locomotor system. And all this is regulated by the nerve system. Yeah, so to the passive locomotor system belongs all parts which are passively moved. So bones, joints, tendons, ligaments, whatever. So every more or less passive structure is moved by the muscles belonging to the active locomotor system. But they are functionally and mechanically correlated. So for example, if we have foals which are born, or horses which are born with asymmetries in the cervical spine. So it's not really rare that you have asymmetries in the cervical spine. For example, one of the processes on the left side is bigger than some processes on the right side in one cervical part. And this means that all these horses will have a little bit skewness. So these horses are not symmetrical. And you can also see asymmetries in other parts of the locomotor system. So the bones can be shaped asymmetrical between left and right, or between lateral and medial. And this is correlated to different functions of connected soft tissues, for example, muscles. So of course, if you have a skew skeleton, you have a asymmetrical muscle work. Yeah, and this is more or less shaping each other. So if the foal is born in the first year, 100% of the bone tissue is changed. So to adapt to biomechanical load and of course to grow. But during this phase, the whole skeleton adapts to the stimulus, to the mechanical stimulus experienced by the young horse. And this is also shaping the function of the muscles. Yeah. And now we just have a closer look to the flight arc, or to the subdeviation of swing phase according to Denoir. And it's important to explain you in the next slides during which phase, which muscles or which parts of the locomotor system are mainly loaded. So the first half of the pendulum phase is the retraction of the limb. So it lasts from breakover until the fetlock is more or less perpendicular under the elbow. And this is more or less passive, because we all know during swing phase, the fetlock is extended and all the tendons on the palmar or plantar side are under strain. So they store kinetic energy and they save it as elastic energy. And in the second part of stance phase, the tendons release this energy and the limb is protracted to swing phase. So the first half of swing phase is related to the function of the limb during stance phase. So if all the shock absorbing structures are working well, and also the shoulder girdle and the musculature, which are responsible to make shock absorption and store energy, if all these mechanisms are working well, you have a very active and nice protraction of the limb to swing phase. In the mid of swing phase, you have the maximum flexion of the limb, and this is the highest part of the flight arc. So here the flight arc peaks, and this is more or less the first third until the limb is passing the contralateral limb. So, but this is very individual. So the peak is different, and also limb and conformation related. And then the second half of the swing phase starts, and this is the protraction of the limb. And shortly before landing, we have the slight retraction just to decelerate the limb and to have less forces acting during initial contact. Yeah. So these more or less two phases we have. And just to conclude it, we have the first phase related to the release of the stored energy as shown in the video. Then the limb is more or less passive, commuting around the shoulder. And here just one comment for example, saddle fitting. If you have a too narrow saddle in the shoulder, of course, the rotation of the scapula, so of the shoulder, is a little bit limited, and it's also affecting the motion of the limb during swing phase. Yeah, so sometimes horses are just not able to really have an active movement of the shoulder and the limb in swing phase. And the second part of swing phase is mainly related to the muscle work. So the proximal muscles actively maintain the given motion during swing phase. Yeah, so the distal limb just follows passively. There are no muscles. It's just following due to inertia of mass. And the proximal locomotor system maintain the motion. Yeah, so the muscles are more important for the second part of swing phase. And all the muscle work is more or less coordinated by the nervous system. So you have usually a working muscle and an opposing player, so agonist and antagonist, and they have to regulate the motion. And this is signal dependent. So the nervous system plays a very important role to maintain and to coordinate and regulate the swing phase. And as we said, in the first part of swing phase, we have a flexion of all joints. So the coffin joint, fetlock joint, carpus, elbow, shoulder, all joints are flexed, and a protraction of the limb is more or less maintained or given by the activity of the shoulder girdle. So you don't need to know the names of the muscles. I just wrote them down, but it's important that you remember, that you understand that the motion of the limb in the first part of swing phase is related to the activity of the shoulder muscles. Yeah, so if you look at the muscles around the shoulder, if you imagine they contract, they are responsible to move the limb in the first part of swing phase. It's actually not just an active movement, it's also the passive release of stored energy, because all highlighted muscles during stance phase, they are also under strain. They also store energy. They are also store elastic energy to release it if the limb is released and moved to swing phase. Yeah. So if you see, for example, some of your customers, and I think I was asked yesterday to speak a little bit about this topic in the next presentation as well. So if you check your customers, for example, if you see the muscle highlighted with B, yeah, these muscles are usually very poor developed in some horses. So you have sometimes a lack of muscles here in the spine of the over the spine of the cervix, then of the neck. Then you have, for example, here a little hole where you have the saddle or the beginning of the saddle around the shoulder. So these muscles are often not function very properly. And this is why some horses just can't move their limb very actively. So some of your clients may ask you or say, yeah, after shoeing, or can you shoe the horse to have a little bit more active motion pattern during swing phase? And if you check the horses and you train your eye to see some problems in the muscles, you will see that it's sometimes just not possible to change something by shoeing. You should change the training on the riding of the horse. Yeah. And then the second part of swing phase is mainly maintained by the activity of the neck muscles. So for example, the muscle highlighted with A is running from the neck and from the skull to the brachium, so to the arm, to the front limb. And this is the connection between limb, spine of the, between limb, neck, and the occiput. And this is a muscle who is also trained if you have dressage horses and you would like to have a very active motion of the limb in swing phase. So if the muscle highlighted with A is very strong, you have a strong muscle to lift and protract the limb in the second part of stance phase. And there is the riding where you have a very strong flexing of the neck and the head. And this is just not very comfortable, and it's destroying the spine, and it's very harmful for the horse. But it's done just to train this particular muscle. It's I think it's terrible, and I will show you the next time the damage it causes. But it's just to move the limb active in the second part of stance phase. Yeah, so the second part of sense phase is mainly maintained by the neck muscles. In the hinds, it's a little bit different. You have the flexion of the coffin joint, the fetlock, hock, and stifle and hip. So all joints are flexed in the first part of swing phase, from lift off to protraction of the limb. And it's mainly maintained by the muscles running between the lumbar spine and the pelvis. So these muscles, they are also quite often under tension. And if you remember the horses of your clients, for example, you know that a lot of horses have problems in the lumbar spine. It's mainly due to riding and the use of the horse and overload of this region. But if you have problems in the lumbar spine, they can't bend and flex their back very good. So then, of course, it's difficult for the horses to have a good protraction of the limb and a good movement of the limb in swing phase. And in the second part of swing phase, we have still increasing flexion of the hip joint, but extension of the fetlock, hock, and stifle. And this is more or less done by the gluteal muscles, so by the muscles highlighted with A. And again, these muscles are connected to the iliosacral joint, so the pelvis. So also there, you know, these regions are also quite sensitive and overloaded in horses. So if, for example, the stride is very short in the hinds, so if the swing phase is very short, you usually have problems in the muscles highlighted with A and B. And to make it even more complicated, yeah, it's not just the muscles around the shoulder and the pelvis. It's also important to know that the muscles of the back and the abdominal muscles are responsible to move the limbs in swing phase. So the limbs in swing phase can't move properly if you don't have enough flexion and extension in the back. So if you would like to move the hinds underneath the body, or you would like to extend the fronts, it's always related to a proper movement in the back. And we all know that our horses have a lot of back problems. So this is why we see quite often asymmetries in swing phase or too low flight arcs in swing phase, just because we have back problems or weak abdominal muscles. And all these motions are regulated by the central nervous system. So, and you have a certain level of interaction. So usually you have the spine, the brain, the cerebellum, and the cerebrum who regulate the motion. And I don't want to make it too complicated, but the most simplest motion is the spine motion, the motor activity regulated by the spine. And this is a very simple locomotion, and you don't need to think about this motion. And the most easiest example is a reflex. So you have a sensor giving a feedback to the spine, and then just the spine, not without any interaction with the brain, gives a signal to the muscles, and you will have a certain effect, a certain reaction. But the spine is also very important for a normal standardized movement. And I will explain you the next slides how. In the horses, or in general, we have different receptors in the muscles, just giving feedback for the muscle tension. And we have some mechanoreceptors in the joints and the tendons, for example. But we all know that we don't have muscles in the distal limb of the horse, but we have very strong muscles in the proximal limb. And now the most important fact is that the spindle cells, so the receptors in the muscles, are the fastest in the whole body. So they are even faster than pain. So their signal always dominates the signal of all other receptors. And this is maybe one explanation why the signal or why the muscles more or less dominate the regulation of movement, and not the distal limb, for example, with the hoof or the mechanoreceptors of tendons and joints. So now we raise the question about the importance of proprioception at the hoofs. We all know that in particular at the frog, we have a high density of proprioceptors, so little receptors giving feedback to the spine and also to regulate movement, for example, but also to give some sensory feedback to the central nervous system. Now we have the questions of the hoofs. or the feedback from the hoofs is responsible for movement of the horse, for example, in swing phase or in stance phase. We don't have any research for swing phase, but we did a little study for stance phase. And you see the motion pattern of the left and right hoof of one sound horse. We tested 10 sound horses before perineural anesthesia. So you see the left hoof and the right hoof. The right hoof, for example, shows a lateral landing and then a break over the lateral toe. It's a little bit similar to the ring of Werkman output. So this little line shows you initial contact, the movement during landing, then mid-stance, breakover, and the last hoof ground contact at point of breakover. This is how you can read these images, and you see the left and right hoof of a normal sound horse walking. This is the same horse, and we blocked, so we made an anesthesia of the left foot, and you see the walking pattern, the stance phase pattern is still the same. And even if you don't have any feeling in both feet, you see the motion pattern stays unaffected. In my opinion, it would be the same if we would have been able to analyze the swing phase pattern as well, but we didn't have black at this moment. So that's why I just can show you results for stance phase. But it shows that even the loss of proprioception, the loss of feeling in the digit, in the toe, is not affecting the motion pattern of the horse. So there must be something different. Yeah. The horses were also quite consistent in their stride variability. So the stride variability didn't increase after anesthesia. So they were not stumbling or anything, it was all fine. So the regulation of a normal standardized movement on a straight line on firm ground is not regulated by the sensory feedback from the foot. Yeah. So it would be definitely something different if you have uneven ground, or if you go circles, or you would like to make the horse moving some other patterns. But if it's just walking on a firm ground, as we evaluate horses in our daily work, the foot is not the most important segment. And to understand it, it's important that you know that we have the spine and the brainstem. The spine and the brainstem, they are the most important levels of the central nervous system to coordinate locomotion. Yeah, so this is very basic. You don't have to think about these kind of locomotions. It's just running. So if you walk, for example, you don't think the whole time left limb, right limb, left limb, right limb, or extension, flexion, extension, flexion. It's just very automatic. Yeah, and this is why this motion is just regulated by the spine and the brainstem, and you don't have to think about it. Just our fine motor skills. This is regulated by the cerebellum or by the cerebral cortex if you plan some specific motion events, but this is nothing important for standardized walking. Yeah. Walking belongs to automation of locomotion because we do it the whole time. So if the foal is born, of course, the first hours, it has to learn how to walk. Yeah, and it has to think about it. But after a while, the locomotor system and the nervous system learned how to walk. And in a certain moment, after multiple repetitions, it's automized. And this is a learned motion pattern. Walking is a learned automized motion pattern, and it's not to change very easy. So you, for example, can't change your walking pattern. Yeah, it belongs to your individual motion pattern. This is the same for horses. Yeah. And this is very important in nature because the less attention animal has to focus on locomotion, the faster and better it can react to a changing situation, for example, if it has to flight. Yeah? And it also can adapt its motion to new conditions. So it can learn new motion patterns, yeah, because it has enough space and enough time to adapt or to learn new things. And you see proof for automation of locomotion if you check the horse here in my example. So this is the left hoof of one of our study horses we had from 2013 to 2017, and you see the horse shows always a lateral landing. So different years, different conditions, different seasons, different barefoot or shoeing, So the horse has always the same motion pattern, and it would be the same for swing phase as well. So this is why usually the motion pattern is a fingerprint for horses and also for ourselves. Yeah. The only thing which can definitely change our motion pattern is pain. So of course we can make some orthopedic treatments and we can have an effect, but it's very difficult to calculate. But pain definitely changed the motion pattern. And here you see an example. This horse was quite new. It was very unbalanced. It was not trained. It was not in a good condition. So when we saw her the first time, she had a very strong stride variability seen by the shadows around the yellow and the red line. And you see the variation is very high. And suddenly the horse changed this, and we see we have a very, very small shadow. So the variation decreased from one moment more or less to the other. And this was because the horse was lame. And with the existence of pain, the variation between the strides was very low. This is also a kind of protection mechanism, because if the body is in pain, it tries to avoid all unnecessary motions. And that's why the motion variation, the variability, for example, between strides decreases. And this is just because if you have pain, yeah, the body tries to protect the affected structure. And this is, you have the painful stimulus. This activates by inflammatory mediators some nociceptors, so some little receptors giving feedback to the nervous system that there is pain, so there is a tissue damage, and the limb, for example, need to be protected. And in the brain and the spine, you have the feedback, and then you have a specific reaction to release or to protect the diseased structure and to support healing. This is acute pain. This is very easy. This is, of course, affecting motion, because the reaction is usually that the pain, the limb is released, or that you have a relief posture or something. But this comes very quickly, and it's lasting very short time. And usually we have a defined location of pain, and we know why it is hurting. And if we stop the pain stimulus, so if we eliminate the reason of pain, we have a very good treatment, and we have very fast and normal situation again. But the problem is, if we have chronic pain, all these inflammatory mediators increase, they are more produced, and the pain receptors, they are not sleeping anymore. So usually in acute pain, not all pain receptors are active, just the one which are really needed. Yeah? And if you have chronic pain, all of a sudden, all the nociceptors react. Independent from the pain stimulus, they all are on. Yeah? And also the brain and the spine become more sensitive. So that's why we have a kind of chronic pain syndrome. And in the moment where you have an injured nerve, so for example, in laminitis, if you have bone loss in the distal phalanx and some nerves are damaged, this is one of the most important trigger for a sensitization of the pain system. Yeah, and then suddenly all the painful events are not really, they are not in a normal way. So you have a maladaptation. So it's not really to protect the limb or to protect the affected structure, it's just a too strong reaction of the pain system. And it can also start if you don't even have a painful stimulus. So sometimes just a mechanical stimulus, if you're touching something, or if you try to hammer a nail in the hoof, or the horse is just walking, this is enough in such cases to have a painful feeling. Yeah? So actually, the primary disease is not responsible for the pain feeling anymore. So this is actually just a pain independent from any healing status or any primary disease. Yeah. In these cases, so if you have, for example, arthrosis or navicular syndrome or laminitis with bone loss, all these horses, the primary disease is not really important anymore. The problem is that you have pain independent from these diseases, and it need to be managed separately from the disease, because this chronic pain changes the whole nervous system, and by changing the whole nervous system, it's also changing the motor response. So in these horses, you can't expect a proper normal swing phase, because the whole mechanism between pain and locomotor system is disturbed. So they try to escape from the painful feeling the whole time, and they adapt their posture and their gait. And if you then try to change something with your shoeing, for example, you cannot win, because the pain is always stronger. Yeah. So in conclusion, the swing phase is mainly influenced by the receptor feedback, but mainly from muscles and the proximal locomotor system. It's also mainly influenced by the activity of the muscles of the shoulder and the pelvis, and the interpretation of the central nervous system. So how horses or the horse had a motor learning for developing a specific gait pattern. And then, of course, it's the questions how we can achieve some changes by our trimming and shoeing. Although the muscles and the proximal locomotor system dominate this motion event, I can promise you, you will have an effect. But I would like to show you next time, not just some examples how trimming and shoeing affect the swing phase, but I would also like to open your eyes a little bit how different muscle groups are developed in horses and why we have sometimes dysfunctions and some problems in swing phase. So I think I know that it was a very difficult talk. I really hope that I could bring you the message more or less clear. So if you just take for you that the proximal locomotor system is the most important part to influence swing phase, then I think you learned more or less enough. Yeah, so I think these curves show that we all have to make a learning way. So I think I'm somewhere here. And yeah, maybe we can develop our knowledge together. So maybe we can meet the next time if I speak about trimming and shoeing and how it influences swing phase. And if you have some questions, I think there's still some time to answer them. Yeah, thank you.